In this presentation, I will tackle the human rights-based approach, the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or the UN CEDAW, and the Philippine Magna Carta of Women. Through this discussion, we want to enable the learners to 1. Define the concept of human rights and discuss its implications to people empowerment. Secondly, discuss the concept of human rights-based approach. Next is to enumerate and discuss the principles of the human rights-based approach, and to distinguish it from the traditional development approach. Another one is to discuss the benefits of the human rights-based approach as applied to development efforts, and then be able to discuss the history of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, enumerate and discuss the principles of CEDAW, and then discuss the relevance of CEDAW to the Philippine Magna Carta of Women and its provisions. First of all, let's try to dissect the essence of human rights. According to the United Nations, these are rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other statuses. So rights are essentially part of the characteristics of a human being. And according to UNICEF, human rights are standards that recognize and protect the dignity of all human beings. These are essential in the enjoyment of true essence of life as a human being, which makes human rights as entitlements. And in fact, the United Nations made the standards or guidelines in the setting of goals towards the attainment of development of the member nations. Matrix, you see 17 sustainable goals, and each of these are related to an essential human rights of people. How are human rights related to the concept of people's empowerment? They are essentially linked. The United Nations stated that when people can exercise their human rights, they can stand up for themselves and for each other. They are empowered to shape the decisions that impact their lives. So we find two scenarios. When human rights are respected, there is equality, participation, and inclusiveness. When there is none, there is necessarily discrimination, which drive poverty and inequality. According to the United Nations, empowerment means that this is the situation where everyone can claim their human rights and no one can be left behind. Human rights are the best way to accelerate progress for more equitable and sustainable. Let us now proceed to the concept of the human rights-based approach to development. This is a conceptual framework for the process of human development that is based on international human rights standards and directed to promoting and protecting human rights. This is according to the UN Sustainable Development Goals Organization. Here is a framework of the human rights-based approach. Here you will see the two sectors that are essentially involved in the fulfillment of rights towards sustainable development. The framework is enshrined in the International Human Rights Law Framework, as well as the regional and national legal framework. And the stakeholders, the rights holders, and the duty bearers are empowered through capacity building and knowing, claiming, and realize the rights in the case of the rights holders, and the duty bearers to fulfill their obligation to respect and protect the rights and obligations to fulfill the rights of the rights holders. So here you can see all the principles of the human rights-based approach, which include accountability, equality and non-discrimination, and participation towards capacity building and empowerment. As to the principles of the human rights-based approach, they are represented by the acronym PANEL, which is the Human Rights-Based Approach in Practice, involving participation, accountability, non-discrimination and equality, empowerment, and legality. Now let us watch a short video on this.
What is a human rights-based approach? Taking a human rights-based approach is about making sure that people's rights are put at the very centre of policies and practices. It's a tool to take human rights standards off the page and into practical application in day-to-day life. The panel principles are one way of breaking down what this means in practice. This involves applying the principles of participation, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, and legality to your work, project, organisation, or campaign. Participation. Everyone has the right to participate in decisions which affect them. Participation must be active, accessible, and meaningful. How do you ensure that rights holders, the people whose rights are affected, participate meaningfully in the development of these activities? Accountability. There should be monitoring of how people's rights are being affected, as well as remedies when things go wrong. Can you identify the duty bearers, the people and organisations with human rights obligations, in each scenario or activity? And are you one of them? Do rights holders have access to effective and meaningful accountability processes when things go wrong? Non-discrimination. All forms of discrimination must be prohibited, prevented, and eliminated. People who face the biggest barriers to realising their rights should be prioritised. How do you identify the rights impact of activities on people with protected characteristics? Who do you work with whose rights are most at risk? This might be related to other factors such as poverty or geography. Empowerment. Everyone should understand their rights and be fully supported to take part in developing policy and practices which affect their lives. How does this activity help rights holders, people whose rights are affected, understand and claim their rights? Legality or law. Approaches should be grounded in the legal rights that are set out in domestic and international laws. What human rights are affected by this activity? What are the relevant standards which need to be met?
Now you have already learned the framework of the HRBA. Essentially, we need to appreciate and adopt and be part of this. You may either be a rights holder if you are not a part of the government or part of those who are obliged to fulfill the rights of the citizens. They are the duty bearers. And now you also should know that you have the obligation as rights holders to know, to claim, and to realize the rights as well. And you have the right to know that the duty bearers have the obligation to respect and protect your rights and to fulfill those rights. It is part of the government's obligation. Now let us take a look at the distinction of the human rights-based approach as against the traditional development approach. There are 5 distinctions. One, that development is independent from human rights under the traditional approach. Also, that development processes are based on sectoral expertise, for example, scientific, engineering, industrial, and medical sector, processes that are guided by normative management processes, and the target outcomes are based on sectoral goals. Processes focus only on the target outputs and not so much on the capacitating the stakeholders. The human rights-based approach, on the other hand, is based on the human rights legal framework. It means that the laws containing or mandating human rights protection govern the development processes. The end goal of development interventions, regardless of sectoral ground, is the realization of human rights based on the human rights standards. Development processes are also guided by human rights principles. You already learned about the panel for the participation, accountability, non-discrimination and equality, and legality. Development interventions target the elimination of the causes of barriers of enjoyment of human rights and not really on sectoral goals. It's all about fulfillment of human rights. Processes involves the duty bearers and the rights holders. Both of them have each of them has an essential role to play. So, what are the benefits of the human rights-based approach as applied to development efforts? Essentially, development outcome of human rights-based approach is building capacities, which will ensure sustainability of development processes and efforts. On the part of the rights holders, the capacity to know, to claim and demand justice relative to their rights. And for the duty bearers, the capacity to fulfill the obligations with respect to respecting, fulfilling, and protecting the rights of the rights holders. Rights holders are enabled to know, participate in the development process and demand for the fulfillment of their rights. And duty bearers are made accountable to respect, fulfill, and protect the rights of the rights holders. And now we come to state that development, especially in poor countries like the Philippines, must essentially empower the marginalized to be sustainable. Now we come to another important topic, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. The learners are challenged to connect HRBA with CEDAW.
The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women is an international human rights treaty that focuses on women's rights and women's issues worldwide. It follows the following three principles: substantive equality, non-discrimination, and state obligation. This video explains the principle of substantive equality. There are many contributing reasons to inequality. Some people are born with much more access and opportunities as compared to others. Gender stereotypes enforce the difference between men and women. It labels women as weak and in need of protection. But in reality, both men and women share the same traits except for reproductive capabilities. Women and men are different, but ultimately, we're equal. Inequality between men and women is also reinforced by the patriarchy system that sees men as leaders. Some people argue that men should have greater rights to economic resources because they have the responsibility of providing for their family. However, this belief does not match reality. Today, women are unmarried, divorced, widowed, or otherwise separated or abandoned by circumstances and are the sole providers. In Southeast Asia, many households are headed by women. It is estimated that 70% of the world's poor are women. Equality for women can be viewed in three approaches. formal, protectionist, and corrective. In the formal approach, society ignores that men and women are actually different. It follows the male standards, disregarding women's special needs. For example, a factory allows men and women to take night shifts. But if the factory is not well lit, it can lead to assaults. This may discourage women from doing night shifts. In the protectionist approach, women lose opportunities because they are perceived as vulnerable and prohibited from participating in certain activities. In the same example, the factory has a policy of not employing women on night shifts to protect them from being assaulted. This does not address the problem and denies women extra income. In the corrective approach, priority is given to correct the environment in order to benefit both men and women equally. The factory could install more lights and provide transport for women in order to create a safe and enabling environment for them to work night shifts. Corrective approach leads to substantive equality. It recognizes differences but affirms equality between men and women. It places an obligation to correct the environment that disadvantages them. It evens out the playing field, and it requires laws and policies to take gender perspective into account. Substantive equality ensures that women have equality in opportunities, equality in accessing those opportunities, and equality in getting results or benefits. State obligation. The CEDAW Convention is one of the most widely ratified United Nations treaties worldwide. 188 countries have ratified the CEDAW Convention. For example, Country Z has signed the CEDAW Convention. This means that the government in Country Z is a state party to CEDAW and has agreed to take measures to improve women's status in the country. In a democratic country, there are three branches of power: legislative, executive, and the judiciary. The legislature makes, amends, and repeals laws. It also controls national finances or budgets. The executive branch enforces the laws and runs the government of the day. It is also responsible for the implementation of laws and delivering of services such as education and welfare. The judiciary is responsible for administration of justice and interpreting the Constitution and various laws. Therefore, in Country Z, these three branches must work hand in hand to achieve gender equality. When Country Z ratified the CEDAW Convention, it became a legally binding document. The state is obligated to subscribe to the articles of the convention and effectively implement it as soon as possible. Every 4 years, states have to report to the CEDAW Committee on the measures taken to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill the rights of women in their countries based on the convention. The state has to respect the rights of women. It cannot do anything that violates women's rights, such as enact discriminatory laws or engage in discriminatory practices. The state must also repeal all discriminatory laws. The state has to protect the rights of women. It must ensure that there are mechanisms for complaints and redress, regulate private actors such as businesses, corporations, or even individuals to ensure that they do not violate women's rights, prohibit discrimination, and impose sanctions against discriminatory acts. The state has to promote the rights of women. It must raise awareness of women's rights in the country. The state has to fulfill the rights of women. It must take positive steps and provide enabling conditions, develop capacity of its institutions, and build women's ability to ensure equality. It must also remove hurdles that women face to ensure both de jure and de facto equality. This means that the state also has an obligation to implement temporary special measures. These are measures taken to give temporary advantages to women in order to accelerate women's equality and address historical discrimination. For example, despite schools being built and equipped with teachers in the rural areas in Country Z, it was found that girls were not coming to school. This example is based on a real-life scenario. Upon investigation, it was found that since the majority of teachers were men, and due to cultural practices, the families were not willing to allow their daughters to be around men. Secondly, the family relied on the labor of female children to take care of household responsibilities. In rural areas, families feel that girls' education is not as important as household chores, and she will later be married into another family. They feel it's a waste of resources to educate girls. The state is responsible to ensure that the education of girls is just as important. As a temporary special measure until the environment is corrected, the government should put in place a policy to recruit more female teachers in rural schools and to give the family a stipend to compensate for the loss of labor of the female children. They should also pass laws to make it compulsory for girls to attend schools. Other examples of temporary special measures include reserving some seats in decision-making positions for women. If women make up half of the population, women's voices must be represented in decision-making positions so that their interests are not left out. In summary, the state party to the CEDAW Convention must act with due diligence, which means that the state is accountable for all discrimination against women, whether she is in the private or public sphere. To prevent discrimination, prohibit discrimination, identify discrimination and provide redress, impose sanctions against discriminatory acts, promote women's rights and equality through proactive measures, Most countries around the world have signed the CEDAW Convention. This means that they have given their commitment to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill the rights of women in their respective countries. However, discrimination still exists in many countries, both directly and indirectly. Many countries practice nationality laws that directly discriminate against women and children. For example, fathers are allowed by law to transfer their citizenship to their children, but mothers cannot. Without citizenship, the child is excluded from healthcare, education, and other services offered to citizens. Indirect discrimination comes from gender-neutral laws and policies, which seem to give equal opportunities and access to both men and women. But in practice, women are disadvantaged due to historical discrimination caused by the patriarchal system. For example, a newspaper company is hiring an editor and invites both men and women reporters to apply, on condition that the candidate must have served in all the different news desks before. But this indirectly disqualifies all the women reporters, as there is another policy that disallows women from serving on the crime desk due to the high risk involved. As a result, no women can apply for the job. Patriarchy is a social system in which the role of the male as the primary authority figure is central to social organization, and where fathers hold authority over women, children, and property. It implies the institution of male rule and privilege, and is dependent on female subordination. In the patriarchy system, male traits are more valued than female traits. For example, you will often hear boys and men being told not to be a girl. This happens because patriarchy views womanhood as weakness, and it is valued less compared to men. In many countries, women face obstacles due to cultural and religious practices. As a result of these beliefs and practices, women have suffered historical discrimination. For example, female genital mutilation, a practice where part of the female genitalia is cut or disfigured, has been defended as a religious responsibility or a traditional passage to womanhood. However, it has been proven that unlike male circumcision, female genital mutilation offers no benefits to the women and can cause medical complications, and in some cases results in death. It is important to keep in mind that non-discrimination for women must exist in de jure and de facto. De jure means of law, and de facto means of fact, meaning what is actually happening in reality. For example, there is a fish farm project in the village of Loma. The policy states that it would provide equal opportunities to women and men to become farmers and better their livelihoods. All parts of training will be available to everybody, but one of the conditions states that applicants must have some farmland to work in. During implementation, no women participated. It is found that women do not own farmlands in the village, as inheritance laws were discriminatory and did not allow women to inherit property. The local culture also prohibits women to control or access family income or assets, including their husbands' farms. A lot of laws and policies exist which is supposed to benefit women, but did not take into account the historical discrimination that prohibits women from enjoying those rights.
So what is the CEDAW? Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women is an international Bill of Rights of women. When we say Bill of Rights, this is a bundle of provisions that protect the rights of women at the international sphere. It is adopted by the United Nations in 1979 and it took effect in 1981. The Philippines signed it on July 1980. The Senate ratified it on August 5, 1981. The Philippines is the first Asian country to ratify the UN CEDAW. But as of 2015, the convention has been ratified by almost all countries. Philippines also ratified the optional protocol to CEDAW. What is the optional protocol to CEDAW? This is a mechanism that enables women to seek redress for complaints of violations of CEDAW through the communication procedure and inquiry procedure addressed to the United Nations. So this is possible because by ratifying the optional protocol to the CEDAW, the Philippine government has effectively relinquished some of its sovereignty over the cases concerning the violations of the convention. The CEDAW is the human rights treaty which affirms the productive rights of women and targets cultures and tradition as influential forces shaping gender roles and family relations. It affirms women's rights to acquire, change, or retain their nationality and the nationality of their children. Now let us discuss the summary of provisions of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. In Article 1, here the concept of discrimination is clearly defined to be any distinction, exclusion, or restrictions made on the basis of sex which has the effect of or purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise by women, irrespective of their marital status, on the basis of equality of men and women, of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, and other fields. So that is a very important provision of the CEDAW, which you will find to be reflected essentially in the provisions of our very own Magna Carta of Women. In Article 2, here what is provided are country duties, wherein countries must eliminate discriminatory laws, policies, and practices in the national legal framework. So, the Philippines, being a signatory to the CEDAW, is obliged to examine its laws for revision of those discriminatory provisions. Under Article 3, the CEDAW provides for equality principle, wherein it says that women are fundamentally equal with men in all spheres of life, and countries must take measures to uphold women's equality in political, social, and economic and cultural fields. Under Article 4, come to know about temporary special measures. What does this mean? It means that countries may implement temporary special measures to accelerate women's equality. These are interventions that are obviously by nature temporary, meaning if their goals have already been attained, the countries have the option to change the legal provisions. Under Article 5, on prejudice, countries agree to modify or eliminate practices based on assumptions about inferiority or superiority of either sex. So this also has something to do with discrimination. Article 6 focuses on trafficking, human trafficking, which is a very serious global problem as well as in the local setting. Article 7 political and public life, provides that women have an equal right to vote, hold public office, and participate in civil society. Article 8 on international work, women have the right to work at the international level without discrimination. Article 9 on nationality, women have equal rights with men to acquire, change, or retain their nationality and that of their children. Article 10 on education, it is provided that women have equal rights with men in education, including equal access to schools, vocational training, and scholarship opportunities. Article 11 on employment, it is provided that women have equal rights in employment, including without discrimination on the basis of marital status or maternity. Article 12 on health provides that women have equal rights to affordable health care services. Article 13, economic and social life, women have the right to family benefits, financial credit, and participation in recreational activities equal to those of men. In Article 14, rural women have the right to adequate living conditions, participation in development planning, and access to health care and education. In Article 15, equality before the law provides that women and men are equal before the law. Women have the right to legally enter into contracts, own property, and choose their place of residence. Article 16 on marriage and family relations. Women have equal rights with men in matters related to marriage and family relations. The rest of the articles of CEDAW pertain to administrative concerns. Article 17 to 24 deals with the Committee on CEDAW, and reporting procedure, while Articles 25 to 30 finally provides details on the administration of the Convention. 70 to 24 deals with the Committee on the CEDAW and reporting procedure. Here, it is provided that regularly the countries parties to the Convention are obliged to submit compliance reports to the UN CEDAW Committee. Article 17 to 30 provides for the administration of CEDAW by the parties to the Convention, meaning all state parties have to comply to the provisions of CEDAW and they are accountable to the Committee on CEDAW. They, including the Philippines, are obliged to submit compliance reports regularly to enable the United Nations to monitor the compliance of the parties to the provisions of this agreement. Let us proceed to the next important topic, which is the Magna Carta of Women of the Philippines. This was enacted on August 14, 2009. What you see on the screen is the slide, is the page of the actual legislation. This is Republic Act 9710, or the Act providing for the Magna Carta of Women. This was signed by the Gloria Macapagal Arroyo on August 14, 2009, which I actually witnessed. The passage of the Republic Act 9710 took around 1 decade because of the difficulty of passing a law in a male-dominated Congress. And there are provisions that may not have been acceptable to the majority of the members of Congress, which are supportive of the rights of women, particularly the poor women, the urban and the rural women. The Magna Carta of Women original proposed bills advanced the rights of rural women. Later on, it will be more comprehensive. And with the perseverance of feminist groups who lobbied non-stop in Congress, it was finally enacted with the signing of the bill into law by the then President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo during the 14th Congress on August 14, 2009. Of course, you know that that president was arrested in 2011 for electoral sabotage complaint, and in 2012 a plunder case, but eventually she will rise to power again when President Duterte assumed power. Anyway, the Magna Carta of Women is a great milestone for the Philippine feminist movement, as the law turned out to be a comprehensive bill of women's rights. The Magna Carta of Women is a great milestone for the Philippine feminist movement, as the law turns out to be a very comprehensive bill of women's rights. Its salient provisions makes its essence to be the local version of the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, if not broader and more detailed. It was even enacted prior to the creation of the UN Women, which is a branch of the United Nations, created in June 2010. And on this page, you will see the resolution number 1, series of 2010, where the Philippine Commission on Women adopted and approved the implementing rules and regulations of the Magna Carta of Women. It not only covered women per se in general, but women in the following particular sectors. So the girl children, the fisher folks, the migrant workers, moral, youth, persons with disabilities, senior citizens, urban and rural poor, solo parents, workers, and other sectors that are marginalized. So what are the provisions of the Magna Carta of Women? Salient provisions include the sanctioning of all forms of discrimination against women pursuant to the CEDAW. It mandates a policy of gender mainstreaming, maintain government's equitable goals. It declares the rights of women to be human rights, and it requires review and, if necessary, amendment or repeal of laws that are discriminatory to women. It also ensures women's equitable participation and representation in government, political parties, international bodies, civil service, and private sector. It affords equal opportunities to women in relation to education, employment, livelihood, social protection, and others, including women in the military. It mandates the access to information and services pertaining to women's health and pushes for the empowerment. Now, this law strengthens the government office that is in charge of the implementation of the laws pertaining to women. The former National Commission on the Role of Filipino Women is now renamed as the current Philippine Commission on Women. The law also creates a special agency under the Commission on Human Rights. It now may serve as an ombud to specifically handle matters pertaining to violations of the implementation of the law. Also, the law provides for penalties for violations of the Magna Carta. So the following also presents to us the salient provisions of it provides for protection from all forms of violence, protection and security in times of disaster, calamities, and other crisis situations, participation and representation, equal treatment before the law, equal access and elimination of discrimination against women in education, scholarship specifically provided as well are equal participation in sport, non-discrimination in employment in the field of military, police, and other services, non-discriminatory derogatory portrayal of women in media and film, comprehensive health services, health information and education, leave benefits, and equal rights. Okay, now we have reached the end of our presentation. In summary, we have learned that 1. Human rights are universal entitlement of all individuals as humans, and they need to be respected, fulfilled, and protected in order to attain human or people empowerment. Secondly, that human rights-based approach is the most effective way or approach to sustainable development as it engages both rights holders and duty bearers with respect to their obligation relative to human rights. Third, principles of the human rights-based approach to development includes participation, accountability, non-discrimination, equality, and legality, and compared or distinguished from the traditional development approach which focus on sectoral goals and outcomes. The human rights-based to development focus on the fulfillment of rights. Next, that the human rights-based approach to development results to capacity development for stakeholders, which is an essential element to sustainability. Next, CEDAW is an international human rights instrument for the protection of women from discrimination and for promotion of equality and empowerment. Next, that CEDAW principles are non-discrimination, state obligation, and substantive equality. And lastly, that the Philippine Magna Carta of Women is the Philippine version of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Is broader, more empowering, and applicable to the rights of Filipino women. That's the end of my presentation. I hope you learned a lot.